The ballroom of Ashworth House blazed with 1,000 candles on that fateful November evening in 1823, their golden light reflecting off crystal chandeliers and illuminating the cream of London society in all their finery. It was the social event of the season, and every eye in that glittering assembly was fixed upon one man, Julian Blackwood, the Duke of Thornfield, as he stood frozen in the center of the marble floor, his face a mask of stunned disbelief. Lady Catherine Pemberton, his fiancée of 2 years, had just removed the diamond engagement ring from her finger with deliberate slowness, placed it in his trembling palm, and announced in a voice loud enough to carry across the hushed room that she could not possibly marry a pauper. The word hung in the air like poison. Pauper. The Duke of Thornfield, reduced to nothing. Around him, the whispers began like a rising tide, a symphony of scandal that would be repeated in every drawing room in England by morning. His business partner, the man he had trusted with every penny of his fortune, had fled to the continent 3 days prior, leaving nothing but empty accounts and forged documents. Julian had discovered the theft only that afternoon, and now as he stood before 300 members of the aristocracy, he realized that Catherine had known even before he did. She had simply waited for the most public moment possible to sever their connection, to ensure that everyone would know she had been wise enough to abandon a sinking ship. The humiliation was so complete, so absolute, that Julian felt something break inside his chest, something that had nothing to do with lost money or social standing. It was the shattering of every assumption he had ever held about loyalty, about love, about the world he thought he understood. He had been the Duke of Thornfield since his father's death when he was barely 21, had spent a decade managing vast estates and wielding power that others could only dream of, and in the span of 72 hours it had all crumbled to dust. The faces surrounding him were no longer friendly or respectful. They were hungry, delighted even, feeding on his downfall with the particular cruelty that only high society could muster. These were people he had dined with, danced with, made business arrangements with, and not one of them stepped forward to offer a word of comfort or support. Catherine herself had already turned away, her silk skirts whispering across the floor as she walked directly into the arms of Viscount Whitmore, a man whose fortune was secure and whose pockets were deep. The message was unmistakable. In this world you were only as valuable as your bank account, and Julian Blackwood's account was empty. I am so glad you are here with me today, dear listener, because this is a story about the moment when everything falls apart and the unexpected hand that reaches out to pull us back from the edge. Before we continue with Julian's journey from the heights of power to the depths of despair, and then to something far more valuable than he ever possessed before, I invite you to subscribe to this channel and leave a like on this video. These stories of resilience, of love that transcends social barriers, and of the triumph of true character over shallow appearances need voices like yours to spread them further. Your support means the world, and it allows me to continue bringing you these deeply moving historical romances. Now, let us return to that terrible November night and understand how Julian Blackwood arrived at this devastating moment. The engagement to Lady Catherine had been arranged 2 years earlier, a union that made perfect sense to everyone involved. She was the daughter of an earl, beautiful, accomplished, and trained from birth to be the wife of a powerful man. Julian had believed himself fortunate, had convinced himself that affection would grow from respect and shared goals. He had been wrong about so many things. The business venture that destroyed him had seemed equally sound. A shipping enterprise with a man he had known since their days at Oxford, a man whose family name was as old as his own. But Marcus Hartwell had been living a double life, maintaining the appearance of success while secretly drowning in gambling debts, and when the moment came to choose between honesty and survival, he had chosen to rob his partner blind and disappear into the night. Julian had signed documents without reading them carefully, had trusted where he should have verified, had been so confident in his own judgment that he never imagined betrayal from that quarter. The irony was bitter. The very arrogance that came from a lifetime of privilege had blinded him to the truth until it was far too late. As the ball continued around him, as musicians hesitantly resumed playing and couples returned to dancing, as though nothing extraordinary had occurred, Julian walked through the crowd toward the exit. No one met his eyes. No one spoke to him. He was already a ghost, a cautionary tale. A man who had fallen from grace so spectacularly that association with him had become social poison. His carriage waited in the curved driveway, and as he climbed inside, he caught his reflection in the polished window. He barely recognized himself. At 31 years old, he looked haggard, hollow, like a man who had aged a decade in a single evening. The driver knew without being told to head for Thornfield Manor, the country estate that was all Julian had left, the one property that had been in his family for so many generations that it could not be sold or seized. It was also crumbling, outdated, and located so far from London that it might as well have been another world. As the carriage rolled through the dark streets and out into the countryside, Julian made a decision. He would retreat to Thornfield, hide himself away from the world that had rejected him, and live out his days in bitter solitude. He wanted nothing more to do with society, with trust, with hope itself. What Julian did not know, could not possibly have known as he made that desperate journey into exile, was that waiting for him in the shadows of that decaying manor was a woman he had never truly seen. Beatrice Winters had been a housemaid at Thornfield since she was 16 years old, one of only 5 servants, who remained after the others had been dismissed for lack of funds to pay them. She was now 24, a woman of uncommon intelligence and quiet strength, who had spent 8 years moving through the halls of the manor like a ghost herself, unnoticed and unappreciated by the master who employed her. Julian had never asked her name, had never looked directly at her face, had treated her as nothing more than a functional part of the household machinery. To him, she was simply the girl who brought his morning tea, who cleaned the ashes from his fireplace, who existed only to serve and then disappear. But Beatrice had watched him over those years, had observed both his virtues and his flaws, and she had seen something in Julian Blackwood that he no longer saw in himself. When he arrived at Thornfield 3 days after the ball, broken and hollow and ready to give up on life itself, it would be Beatrice who stepped out of the shadows and spoke words that would change everything. In the space of seconds, with a handful of sentences delivered in her soft, steady voice, she would plant a seed that would grow into salvation, into transformation, and ultimately into a love neither of them could have imagined. But that moment was still ahead, waiting in the cold halls of Thornfield Manor, and Julian had no idea that his true journey was only just beginning. Thornfield Manor stood like a monument to faded glory at the end of a tree-lined avenue, its grey stone walls covered in creeping ivy, its windows dark and unwelcoming in the November twilight. Julian's carriage rattled up the gravel drive just after midnight, and as he stepped down onto the weed-choked courtyard, he felt the weight of his new reality settle over him like a shroud. This place, which he had always considered a burden, a provincial property that required maintenance but offered little pleasure, was now his entire world. The London townhouse would have to be sold to pay creditors, the hunting lodge in Scotland was already gone, and even his stable of thoroughbreds had been auctioned off to settle debts. All that remained was this crumbling estate and the handful of servants who stayed not because they were paid regularly, but because they had nowhere else to go. As Julian crossed the threshold into the entrance hall, he noticed for the first time how shabby everything had become, how the once fine furniture was worn and faded, how the portraits of his ancestors stared down at him with what seemed like accusation rather than pride. Mrs. Dawson, the elderly housekeeper who had served his family for 40 years, met him in the hallway with tears in her eyes. She had heard the news through the servants' network that stretched invisibly across England, that mysterious system of communication that somehow moved faster than any post. She tried to offer words of comfort, but Julian waved her away with a gesture that was more exhausted than unkind, and climbed the stairs to his bedchamber without speaking. The room was cold, the fire unlit, and he did not bother to call for anyone to remedy it. He simply sat in the darkness, still wearing his evening clothes from the ball, and stared at nothing. The hours passed in a blur of bitter thoughts, of replaying every mistake, every misplaced trust, every moment of arrogance that had led him to this point. By the time dawn broke grey and cheerless over the Derbyshire hills, Julian had made a thorough inventory of his failures and found himself utterly without hope. The days that followed were a descent into something darker than mere depression. Julian stopped eating regular meals, stopped bathing, stopped maintaining even the basic routines that structure a gentleman's life. He wandered through the empty rooms of Thornfield like a ghost, haunting his own existence, unable to sleep but unable to fully wake either. Letters arrived from London, legal documents that required his attention, notices from creditors demanding payment, and he burned them all in the library fireplace without reading them. What did it matter? He had nothing left to give, nothing left to fight for. The servants moved around him with worried whispers, but he barely noticed their presence. They were shadows, furniture, part of the landscape of his failure. Mrs. Dawson tried several times to convince him to eat something, to see the estate manager about urgent matters, to at least dress properly, but he ignored her with the same blank indifference he showed to everything else. It was on the 7th day of this living death that Julian stood in his father's old study, staring at the pistol in the desk drawer. The weapon was a matched pair of dueling pistols that had belonged to his grandfather, beautiful things with mother-of-pearl handles and Damascus steel barrels, and they were loaded. His father had always kept them loaded, a habit from more dangerous times. Julian lifted one of them, felt its weight in his hand, and realized with a strange sense of calm that he had found his solution. There was no reason to continue this farce of existence, no reason to drag out the humiliation and the emptiness. He had lost everything that made him who he was, and without his title meaning anything, without his fortune, without respect or purpose, he was nothing. The pistol felt like mercy, like the only choice that made sense. He raised it slowly, his hand surprisingly steady, and prepared to end the pain. The door to the study opened without warning, and a voice he had never truly heard before spoke into the terrible silence. It was soft but clear, firm but not unkind, and it carried a quality that made him pause with the pistol still raised. Beatrice Winters stood in the doorway, her hands folded in front of her plain grey dress, her dark eyes fixed on his face with an expression that was neither shocked nor frightened, but something else entirely. She looked at him as though she could see straight through to his soul, as though she knew exactly what he was about to do and exactly why, and she spoke words that would echo in his mind for the rest of his life. She told him that a man was not measured by what he possessed or what title he carried, but by what he chose to do when everything was stripped away. She told him that she had watched him for 8 years, and she had seen in him a capacity for kindness and honor that had nothing to do with his wealth, moments when he thought no one was looking. She told him that ending his life now would not be an escape from failure, but a surrender to it, and that he was capable of so much more than he believed. Then she did something extraordinary. She walked forward, gently took the pistol from his unresisting hand, and asked him if he would like some tea. The tea arrived in the study 15 minutes later, brought by Beatrice herself on a simple wooden tray with 2 cups instead of 1. Julian sat in his father's leather chair, still too stunned by what had just occurred to fully process it, and watched as this woman he had never truly noticed before poured the steaming liquid with steady, practiced hands. She did not ask permission to sit, simply took the chair across from him as though they were equals, as though she had every right to be there, and this small act of quiet audacity penetrated the fog of his despair more effectively than any amount of sympathy could have. He found himself looking at her, really looking for the first time in 8 years. She was not beautiful in the conventional sense that society prized, not like Catherine with her golden curls and porcelain skin, but there was something compelling in her face, a strength in the set of her jaw, and an intelligence in her dark eyes that suggested depths he had never bothered to explore. She was perhaps 24 or 25, slender but not fragile, with brown hair pulled back in a simple knot and hands that showed the evidence of hard work. She met his gaze without flinching, without the downcast eyes and submissive posture he had always expected from servants, and in that moment Julian realized he had been blind in more ways than one. Over the following weeks, something shifted in the silent halls of Thornfield Manor. Julian did not recover overnight, did not suddenly rediscover hope or purpose, but he stopped actively pursuing death, and that was a beginning. Beatrice seemed to take his survival as her personal mission, appearing at regular intervals with food, with small tasks that required his attention, with observations about the estate that gradually pulled him back into the world of the living. She never overstepped the bounds of propriety, never presumed too much, but there was a firmness in her gentle persistence that would not be denied. She informed him that the south pasture fence needed repair before winter, or they would lose what few sheep remained. She mentioned that the roof over the servants' quarters was leaking and would cost far less to fix now than after the structure rotted. She brought him the estate ledgers and pointed out, with a precision that surprised him, exactly where expenses could be cut and where small investments might yield returns. Julian found himself listening, found himself asking questions, found himself slowly emerging from the dark cave of his grief and humiliation. What astonished him most was not her competence, though that was remarkable enough for a woman who had spent her life in service, but the way she spoke to him. Beatrice did not offer empty platitudes or false cheerfulness, did not pretend that his situation was anything other than dire, but neither did she treat him with the pity he had come to expect from the few servants who remained. She spoke to him as though he were still capable, still intelligent, still a man who could solve problems if he simply chose to try. She challenged him, gently but unmistakably, to stop dwelling on what he had lost and start considering what he might build. When he protested that he had no capital, no connections, no means to rebuild anything, she reminded him that he still had land, still had a functioning mind, and still had the ability to work. The word work seemed almost obscene, coming from her lips in reference to a duke, but she said it without irony, as simple fact, and Julian found he could not argue with her logic. By the time December arrived with its first snowfall, Julian had begun to take control of Thornfield in a way he never had before. He had always managed the estate from a distance, through intermediaries and written reports. But now he walked the fields himself, inspected the tenant cottages, met with the few remaining farmhands to discuss what crops might be viable in the coming year. Beatrice walked beside him on many of these excursions, ostensibly as a guide since she knew every inch of the property better than he did, but really as something more. She was becoming his partner in a way he had never experienced, someone who saw the same problems he saw and worked alongside him to find solutions. There was no romance in it yet, nothing that crossed the vast social divide between them, but there was a growing respect and a deepening connection that felt more real than anything he had known in his previous life. He began to notice small things about her, the way she bit her lower lip when concentrating on a difficult calculation, the quiet humor that occasionally flickered in her eyes, the grace with which she moved despite her plain clothing and humble station. The turning point came on a bitter afternoon in late December, when Julian and Beatrice stood in the manor's old conservatory, a glass-roofed structure that had been used for growing exotic plants in his grandfather's time, but now stood empty and neglected. She had suggested, quite boldly, that the space could be converted into a forcing house for early vegetables that could be sold at premium prices in the London markets. The idea was sound, even brilliant, but it would require an initial investment they did not have. As they discussed the problem, standing among the broken pots and dirt-streaked windows, Julian suddenly saw the future with startling clarity. He saw not just a restored conservatory, but a restored estate, not just financial recovery, but a completely different kind of life, built on work and partnership rather than inherited privilege. And he saw Beatrice, truly saw her, not as a servant but as an extraordinary woman who had saved his life and was now showing him how to live it. The realization shook him to his core, but he said nothing, not yet, because the distance between a duke and a housemaid was still too vast to cross with words alone. First, he needed to prove to himself and to her that he could become the man she believed him capable of being. The winter months transformed both Thornfield Manor and the man who dwelt within it. Julian threw himself into the work of restoration with an intensity that surprised everyone, including himself. He sold the last of his fine clothing, the silverware bearing his family crest, even his father's precious book collection, anything that could generate capital for the investments Beatrice had so carefully outlined. The conservatory was repaired first. Its broken glass replaced pane by painstaking pane, its heating system restored to working order. By February, seedlings were sprouting in neat rows, tended by Beatrice's knowledgeable hands and Julian's increasingly capable ones. He learned to work alongside the remaining farmhands without condescension, to understand the rhythm of planting and harvest, to see the land not as an ornament to his status, but as a living thing that could sustain them all if properly managed. The physical labor exhausted him, left his hands blistered and his back aching, but it also quieted the demons in his mind and gave him something he had not felt in months: purpose. Beatrice remained his constant companion through all of it, though they maintained the careful fiction of master and servant, even as that distinction became increasingly absurd. They spent hours in the estate office reviewing accounts, planning crop rotations, calculating potential profits from the various schemes she proposed with her remarkable mind for commerce. Julian discovered that she had been reading his father's agricultural journals, had taught herself mathematics and bookkeeping during her years of service, had observed and learned from every steward and estate manager who had passed through Thornfield. She possessed an education that rivaled his own expensive tutoring at Oxford, achieved entirely through her own determination and intelligence. He found himself asking her opinion on matters great and small, found himself valuing her judgment above his own, found himself watching her when she was not looking and feeling something dangerously close to admiration blooming into something deeper. But he fought against it, told himself it was merely gratitude, merely respect, because to acknowledge the truth would force him to confront the impossibility of their situation. By spring, the first crops were showing promise, and the conservatory vegetables had indeed sold at premium prices in London, delivered by a carter who asked no questions about the Duke of Thornfield's reduced circumstances. The money was modest, but real, proof that Beatrice's strategies worked, and Julian felt a pride in that first earned income that he had never felt in all his years of inherited wealth. More money came from other sources as her ideas bore fruit: a contract to supply wool to a Manchester mill, rent from repaired tenant cottages, even a small profit from breeding the few horses they had managed to keep. Thornfield was not restored to its former glory, not even close, but it was solvent, functioning, alive again. And Julian was alive too, in a way he had not been even before his fall. He began to understand what Beatrice had meant when she told him that losing everything could be the beginning rather than the end. He had been forced to discover who he was without the trappings of title and fortune, and the man he found beneath those things was someone he could actually respect. It was on an evening in late April, as they worked together in the estate office with the windows open to the spring air, that Julian finally allowed himself to acknowledge what had been growing between them for months. Beatrice was seated at the desk, her brow furrowed in concentration, as she tallied figures in the ledger, and the lamplight caught the curve of her cheek and the delicate strength of her profile. Without thinking, without planning, Julian spoke her name for what might have been the first time ever. She looked up, surprised by something in his tone, and found him watching her with an expression that made her breath catch. He told her then, haltingly, and without the eloquence he had once commanded so easily, what her intervention had meant to him. He told her that she had not merely prevented his death that December day, but had given him a reason to live and a way to do it. He told her that everything good in his new life had come from her wisdom, her strength, her unwavering belief that he could be more than his failures. And then, crossing a line that could never be uncrossed, he told her that somewhere in the midst of rebuilding Thornfield, he had fallen completely and irrevocably in love with her. The silence that followed his confession seemed to stretch forever. Beatrice sat frozen, the pen still in her hand, her eyes wide with shock and something else, something that looked almost like pain. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper, and it trembled with an emotion he could not name. She told him that what he felt was not love, but gratitude, that he was confused by their unusual circumstances and the intensity of the months they had shared. She told him that she was a housemaid, a woman of no family and no fortune, and that whatever he thought he felt would fade once he returned to society and remembered who he truly was. But even as she spoke these words of denial, tears were gathering in her eyes, and Julian understood with sudden clarity that she was protecting him from a scandal that would destroy what remained of his reputation, protecting him even at the cost of her own heart. He reached across the desk and took her hand, that work-worn hand that had saved his life in so many ways, and he told her the truth she needed to hear, that he knew exactly what he felt, that he had never been more certain of anything, and that if she would allow it, he intended to spend the rest of his life proving to her and to the world that true nobility had nothing to do with birth and everything to do with character. Beatrice withdrew her hand as though his touch had burnt her, and stood so abruptly that her chair scraped harshly against the wooden floor. She turned away from him, her shoulders rigid with tension, and when she spoke again, her voice had regained its composure, though it still carried an undertone of anguish. She told him that he did not understand what he was proposing, that the world they lived in would never accept such a union, that he would be cast out completely from society if he attempted to marry so far beneath his station. She reminded him that he had already lost his fortune and his reputation, and that the only thing he still possessed was his title, the one thing that could never be taken away. If he married a housemaid, she said with brutal honesty, he would lose even that in the eyes of everyone who mattered. His peers would turn their backs on him entirely, would refuse to receive him, would treat him as though he had committed an act of social suicide. And she would be blamed for it, she continued, would be seen as a scheming woman who had taken advantage of his vulnerable state to elevate herself through seduction and manipulation. The Ton would destroy them both with gossip and scandal, and everything they had worked so hard to build at Thornfield would be poisoned by the shame of it. Julian listened to her litany of objections with growing frustration, because he knew that every word she spoke was true, and yet none of it mattered to him anymore. He had lived his entire life according to society's rules, had made every decision based on what was proper and expected, and where had it gotten him? Betrayed by his business partner, abandoned by his fiancée, mocked by people who called themselves friends. The aristocratic world that she feared offending had already rejected him completely, had shown him with perfect clarity that their loyalty extended only as far as his bank account. What did he owe them now? What did their opinion matter when weighed against the chance for genuine happiness with a woman who had proven her worth 1,000 times over? He told her all of this, his voice rising with passion, told her that he would rather live in obscurity with her than return to the hollow existence of his former life. He told her that society's rules were designed by people who measured worth in bloodlines and bank balances, and that he had learned through bitter experience how meaningless those measurements were. But Beatrice was not swayed by his arguments, or perhaps she was too swayed, and that frightened her even more. She moved to the window, her arms wrapped around herself as though holding something precious inside, and stared out at the darkening gardens. She confessed then, in a voice so quiet he had to strain to hear it, that she had loved him for years, long before his fall, when he had walked past her in the hallways without seeing her. She had loved him even when he treated her as invisible, had seen glimpses of the man he could be beneath the arrogance of privilege. She had loved him through his engagement to Lady Catherine, had felt her heart break a little more each day as she watched him prepare to marry someone else. And she had loved him through his darkest hours, had stayed at Thornfield when the other servants left, not because she had nowhere to go, but because she could not bear to abandon him when he needed help most. All of this she admitted, with tears streaming down her face, and then she told him why they could never be together. It was not society's judgment she truly feared, she said, but his eventual regret. One day, perhaps years from now, he would wake beside her and remember what he had given up, would see her common hands and humble origins and resent the choice he had made in a moment of gratitude and emotion. She could not bear to watch him grow to resent her, could not bear to become the embodiment of his sacrifice and loss. The rawness of her confession, the depth of love and fear it revealed, broke something open in Julian's chest. He crossed the room in 3 strides and turned her to face him, his hands gentle but insistent on her shoulders. He told her that she had it exactly backwards, that marrying her would not be a sacrifice, but a salvation, not a loss, but the greatest gain of his life. He reminded her that she had told him once that a man was measured by what he chose to do when everything was stripped away, and this was his choice, made with full knowledge and clear eyes. He had been stripped of everything that he thought defined him, and in that nakedness he had discovered what truly mattered. She mattered. Their partnership mattered. The life they were building together mattered. All the rest, the titles and the social position and the approval of people who had shown themselves unworthy of respect, all of that was ash compared to the reality of what they had created together. He begged her to trust him, to trust in what they had built over these months of working side by side, to believe that his love was not a temporary madness, but the first truly sane choice he had made in years. Beatrice looked up at him with those dark eyes that had seen through him from the very beginning, that had looked past the Duke and seen the man, and something in her expression shifted. The fear did not disappear entirely, but it was joined by hope, fragile and tentative, but real. She asked him in a whisper if he was truly certain, if he understood that there would be no going back once this path was chosen, if he was prepared to face the world's condemnation for the sake of a housemaid's love. Julian answered not with words, but with action, drawing her into his arms for the first time, feeling her stiffen briefly and then melt against him as months of restrained emotion finally found release. He held her as she wept, as he wept too, and in that embrace they sealed a pact that neither fully understood yet but both felt in their bones. They would face whatever came together, would build their future not on the ruins of his past, but on the foundation of mutual respect and genuine love they had discovered in the ashes. But first, Julian knew, he needed to complete the restoration of Thornfield, needed to prove to Beatrice and to himself that he could truly stand on his own, and then he would claim her before the world in a way that left no room for doubt or misunderstanding. The months following that watershed evening in the estate office were a study in bitter-sweet restraint. Julian and Beatrice had acknowledged their feelings, had allowed themselves one moment of vulnerable honesty, but both understood that nothing could truly change until Julian had fully reclaimed his independence. They returned to their careful dance of propriety, maintaining the fiction of master and servant in front of the other household staff, but now there was a current of awareness that ran between them like electricity. Every accidental touch of hands over the ledgers, every shared glance across the dinner table, every moment alone in a room carried the weight of promises made and futures imagined. Julian threw himself into the work of restoration with renewed vigor, driven now not just by pride or survival, but by the concrete goal of making himself worthy to offer Beatrice a life that would not be defined by poverty or struggle. He was building something more than a solvent estate. He was building a foundation upon which they could construct their impossible future together. By autumn of 1824, nearly a year after his catastrophic fall, Thornfield Manor had achieved something remarkable. The estate was not merely surviving, but genuinely prospering, generating income that exceeded its expenses for the first time in decades. The conservatory venture had expanded, the wool contracts had proven lucrative, and Julian's willingness to experiment with new agricultural techniques that more traditional landowners scorned had paid unexpected dividends. Word began to spread through the network of farmers and merchants, not through aristocratic channels, but through the working people who actually produced England's wealth, that the Duke of Thornfield was a man transformed. He was spoken of with respect in market towns and village taverns, places where his title mattered far less than his handshake and his willingness to pay fair prices on time. This new reputation was worth more to Julian than all the social standing he had lost, because it was earned rather than inherited, built on character rather than accident of birth. And through it all, Beatrice remained his silent partner. The brilliant mind behind many of his most successful decisions, the steady presence that kept him grounded when doubt threatened to overwhelm him. It was in October, as the leaves turned gold and crimson across the Derbyshire hills, that Julian received an unexpected letter that would change everything. The seal was that of his cousin Robert Blackwood, a man he had not heard from since before his disgrace. Robert wrote that he had been travelling in India on business for the past 2 years and had only recently returned to England to discover the full extent of what had happened to Julian and to the family name. Unlike every other member of Julian's former circle, Robert expressed neither pity nor condemnation, but rather a straightforward offer of assistance. He had done well in his Eastern ventures and was prepared to invest capital in Thornfield if Julian could demonstrate that the estate was a sound business proposition. More importantly, Robert wrote that he was planning to host a ball at his London residence in November to celebrate his return, and he was extending a personal invitation to Julian to attend as his honoured guest. The letter concluded with a postscript that carried particular weight. Robert had heard the rumours about Julian's transformation and wanted to see for himself whether his cousin had truly found a better way to live than the empty carousel of aristocratic society. The invitation represented both an opportunity and a tremendous risk. Julian had avoided London and all contact with his former world for nearly a year, had built his new life in the protective isolation of the countryside. To return to the city, to face the people who had witnessed his humiliation, would require courage of a different kind than the physical labor and financial risk-taking that had occupied him at Thornfield. But as he sat with the letter in his hand, rereading Robert's words, Julian realized that this was exactly the moment he had been unconsciously preparing for. If he wanted to marry Beatrice, if he wanted to give their union any chance of acceptance, or at least tolerance from the world beyond Thornfield, he could not hide in the countryside forever, like a man ashamed of his choices. He needed to return to society, not as the broken, humiliated duke who had fled in disgrace, but as a man reborn, confident in his own worth and ready to claim what he wanted regardless of the cost. The ball would be his opportunity to do exactly that, to make a statement that could not be ignored or dismissed. When Julian showed Beatrice the letter that evening, he watched her face carefully, trying to read the complex emotions that flickered across her features. She understood immediately what he was proposing, what attending that ball would mean, and what he intended to do there. For a long moment she said nothing, simply stared at the expensive paper with its elegant handwriting, and Julian could see the fear and hope warring in her expression. Finally she looked up at him and asked the question that mattered most. Was he absolutely certain that this was what he wanted, that he was ready to face the condemnation and scandal that would inevitably follow if he publicly claimed a housemaid as his intended bride? Julian took both her hands in his, those capable hands that had worked alongside his to save Thornfield, and told her the truth. He said that he had spent the past year becoming a man who could stand on his own, who did not need society's approval to know his own worth, and that the final step in that transformation was to claim openly and proudly the woman he loved. He was not just ready, he told her with quiet conviction. He was eager to show the world what true partnership looked like, to demonstrate that character and compatibility mattered more than bloodlines and bank accounts. The ball would be their moment, their public declaration, and though he could not promise it would be easy, he could promise that he would never regret choosing her over the hollow approval of people who had proven themselves unworthy of respect. The preparation for the London ball consumed the following weeks with an intensity that surprised them both. Julian understood intuitively that this was not merely a social event, but a carefully staged performance, a public declaration that needed to be executed flawlessly to have any chance of achieving its purpose. He could not simply arrive at Robert's ball with Beatrice on his arm and expect society to accept the situation. Such a crude approach would only confirm their worst assumptions about him losing his mind along with his fortune. No, this required strategy, required thought, required the same careful planning that had gone into restoring Thornfield. He needed to re-establish himself first as a man of substance and capability, needed to remind the Ton that he was still the Duke of Thornfield regardless of his reduced circumstances, and only then could he introduce Beatrice in a way that might give their relationship even a slim chance of acceptance. The question was how to accomplish all of this in the space of a single evening, how to transform perception and challenge assumptions that had been calcified over centuries of rigid social hierarchy. Julian's first move was to ensure that his appearance would communicate success rather than failure. He commissioned new evening clothes from a London tailor, not the extravagantly expensive bespoke garments he had worn in his previous life, but well-made pieces that spoke of quality and careful choice. He wanted to look like a man who had found his footing, who had adapted to changed circumstances with dignity rather than desperation. More importantly, he prepared his narrative, the story he would tell about his year away from society. He would not hide what had happened or pretend that his fall had been anything less than complete, but he would frame it as a transformation rather than a tragedy, as the catalyst that had forced him to discover what truly mattered. He practiced this narrative in his mind until it became natural, until he could speak of his time at Thornfield with pride rather than shame, could discuss working alongside his tenants and learning to farm without apology or embarrassment. This was the Julian Blackwood who would return to London, not the arrogant aristocrat who had lost everything, but a wiser, stronger man who had found something more valuable in the ashes. Beatrice, meanwhile, faced her own preparations with a mixture of excitement and dread. Julian had insisted on commissioning a gown for her, a beautiful creation in deep blue silk that transformed her from housemaid to lady without making her into something she was not. When she tried it on for the first time in the Manor's old drawing room, Julian felt his breath catch at the sight of her. The gown did not change who Beatrice was. It simply allowed the rest of the world to see what he had known for months, that she possessed a natural grace and dignity that had nothing to do with birth or training. But Beatrice looked at herself in the mirror with uncertainty, uncomfortable in the unfamiliar finery, and Julian realized that the external transformation was the easy part. The real challenge was preparing her emotionally for what she would face in that London ballroom, the stares and whispers and barely concealed contempt from people who would see her as an interloper, a nobody who had somehow bewitched a duke into forgetting his place. He spent hours talking with her about what to expect, how to hold herself with quiet confidence, how to meet hostility with grace rather than defensiveness. But even as he coached her, he knew that no amount of preparation could truly ready someone for the particular cruelty of high society when it felt threatened or scandalized. The journey to London in mid-November was both shorter and longer than Julian remembered. The countryside rolled past the carriage windows, familiar and yet somehow foreign after his year of isolation, and as they drew closer to the city, he felt old anxieties stirring alongside his determination. Beatrice sat across from him in the carriage, wearing a simple traveling dress, her hands folded in her lap and her face turned toward the window. She had been quiet for most of the journey, lost in her own thoughts, and Julian did not press her to speak. He knew she was frightened, knew she was questioning whether they were making a terrible mistake, and he respected her right to process those fears in her own way. What he did not know, could not know until much later, was that Beatrice was also steeling herself to be strong for him, preparing to face whatever came with her head held high, because she understood that her reaction would shape how society viewed their relationship. If she appeared ashamed or apologetic, if she gave any indication that she believed herself unworthy of Julian's regard, then their cause would be lost before it began. She needed to embody the very principle that Julian had been trying to demonstrate, that worth was intrinsic, not bestowed by title or birth, and that she had every right to stand beside him as an equal. They arrived in London 3 days before the ball, taking rooms at a modest but respectable hotel, rather than attempting to reclaim the townhouse that had been sold to settle debts. Julian spent those days making carefully calculated social calls, re-establishing connections with the few members of his former circle who had not completely turned their backs on him. He visited his cousin Robert first, spending an afternoon discussing the Thornfield restoration in detail and answering pointed questions about his plans for the future. Robert listened with genuine interest, asked intelligent questions about crop yields and investment returns, and finally nodded his approval. He told Julian that he had done something remarkable, had turned a disaster into an opportunity, and emerged stronger for it. Then Robert asked the question that Julian had been expecting. Was the rumor true that he intended to marry one of his servants? Julian met his cousin's eyes steadily and confirmed it, explained who Beatrice was and what she meant to him, and waited for the condemnation. But Robert surprised him. He said that he had seen enough of the world during his travels to know that England's rigid class system was not the only way to organize society, that in many places a man's achievements mattered more than his ancestry. He could not promise that society would accept Julian's choice, Robert said frankly, but he would stand beside his cousin and support him publicly when the moment came. That promise, freely given, meant more to Julian than he could express, because it meant he would not face the aristocratic firing squad entirely alone. The night of the ball arrived with all the weight of inevitability. Julian dressed with meticulous care in his hotel room, his hands steady as he tied his cravat and adjusted his evening coat. But his mind was racing through every possible outcome of what he was about to do. In the adjoining room, Beatrice was preparing with the help of a lady's maid Julian had hired for the occasion, and he could hear the soft murmur of voices through the wall. He wanted to go to her, to offer reassurance or receive it, but he forced himself to wait, to give her these last private moments before they stepped together into the scrutiny of London society. When she finally emerged, dressed in the blue silk gown with her hair arranged in an elegant style that softened her features without erasing their strength. Julian felt every doubt dissolve. She was magnificent, not because the fine clothes transformed her into something she was not, but because they finally allowed the world to see what he had always known was there. She looked like a duchess, like his duchess, and the rightness of it settled into his bones with unshakable certainty. The carriage ride to Robert's Mayfair residence was tense with unspoken emotion. They sat side by side rather than across from each other, and Julian reached for Beatrice's hand, finding it cold despite her gloves. He told her one final time that they could turn back, that he would not think less of her if the prospect of facing that ballroom was too much to bear. But Beatrice squeezed his hand in return and told him with quiet conviction that she had not come this far to retreat at the final hurdle. She reminded him that he had taught her through his own example that courage was not the absence of fear, but the decision to move forward despite it. Whatever happened in the next few hours, she said, they would face it together, and that was all the armor she needed. Her words, simple and sincere, filled Julian with a pride so fierce it was almost painful. This woman, who had every reason to doubt and hesitate, was choosing to walk into potential humiliation with her head held high, and he vowed silently that he would make certain her courage was not wasted. Robert's mansion blazed with light as their carriage pulled up to the entrance, and the sounds of music and conversation spilled out into the November night. The ball was already in full swing. The cream of London society gathered to welcome Robert home and to see and be seen in the eternal dance of aristocratic social climbing. Julian stepped down first and then handed Beatrice out of the carriage, hyper-aware of the footman's barely concealed surprise at the quality of her appearance, at the way Julian treated her with the deference due to a lady of rank. They ascended the steps together, passed through the entrance hall with its glittering chandeliers, and paused at the threshold of the ballroom. Julian felt Beatrice's hand tighten on his arm, felt her draw a deep breath, and then they stepped forward into the light and noise and immediate, suffocating attention. The effect of their entrance was instantaneous and electric. Conversation stopped mid-sentence, heads turned with almost mechanical precision, and a wave of shocked recognition rippled through the assembly. The Duke of Thornfield had returned, and he was not alone. Julian had planned this moment carefully. He did not attempt to fade into the crowd or slip in unnoticed, but instead walked directly toward his cousin Robert, who stood at the far end of the ballroom surrounded by well-wishers. Every step of that long walk was performed under the weight of hundreds of stares, and Julian could hear the whispers starting like wildfire around them. He recognized faces in the crowd, people who had been at that catastrophic ball nearly a year ago, people who had witnessed his humiliation and Catherine's public rejection. There was Catherine herself, standing beside Viscount Whitmore, her mouth falling open in shock at the sight of him. There were the Ashworth sisters, notorious gossips who would ensure that every detail of this evening spread through London by morning. There were business acquaintances who had refused to answer his desperate letters when he needed help, friends who had revealed themselves as mere fair-weather companions. All of them were staring, judging, already constructing the narratives they would spread about this scandalous reappearance. But Julian kept his gaze fixed forward, his spine straight, and his hand steady on Beatrice's arm as they crossed that gauntlet of scrutiny. He was not the broken man who had fled London in shame. He was a man who had rebuilt himself from nothing and discovered in the process what truly mattered. When they reached Robert, Julian's cousin stepped forward without hesitation and greeted him warmly, loudly enough for those nearby to hear, welcoming him back to London and commenting on how well he looked. Then, in a deliberate and calculated gesture that Julian had not anticipated but immediately recognized as a gift beyond price, Robert turned to Beatrice and bowed over her hand as though she were a duchess in truth rather than title. He asked her name, and when Julian introduced her as Miss Beatrice Winters of Thornfield Manor, Robert engaged her in brief but gracious conversation about the estate and her role in its restoration. This public acknowledgement from a respected member of the aristocracy, this treatment of Beatrice as someone worthy of courtesy and attention, created a small island of legitimacy in the sea of scandal. It would not convert the skeptics or silence the gossips, but it established that at least one person of consequence was willing to treat this unusual situation with civility rather than contempt. Other guests began to approach tentatively, curiosity overcoming their shock, and Julian found himself engaged in the first of many conversations that would define the evening. He spoke of Thornfield's restoration with pride and detail, answered questions about his year away with honesty, and introduced Beatrice at every opportunity not as his servant, but as his partner in rebuilding the estate. Each introduction was a small battle won or lost, each reaction a data point in the larger calculation of whether their gambit had any chance of success. As the evening progressed, and the initial shock of their appearance began to fade into speculative murmuring, Julian became aware of a pattern in how people responded to Beatrice. Some guests, particularly the older generation, steeped in rigid tradition, simply refused to acknowledge her existence beyond the barest politeness, treating her as an unfortunate but temporary aberration, in Julian's judgment, that would surely be corrected once he came to his senses. Others, mostly the younger set who fancied themselves progressive, engaged her with a kind of anthropological curiosity, asking questions about her background and her work at Thornfield as though she were an exotic specimen to be studied and discussed at future dinner parties. But there was a third group, smaller but more significant, who spoke to Beatrice with genuine interest and respect. These were people who had themselves chafed against society's restrictions, who had witnessed enough hypocrisy and cruelty among their own class to question whether birth truly determined worth. A young viscountess whose unconventional marriage to a wealthy merchant's son had caused its own scandal years earlier, sought Beatrice out specifically to tell her that courage like hers changed the world in small but important ways. An elderly baronet who had made his fortune in trade before inheriting his title engaged her in a surprisingly sophisticated discussion about agricultural innovation, clearly impressed by her knowledge. These moments of genuine connection, scattered among the hostility and curiosity, gave Julian hope that their cause was not entirely lost. But the true test came when Catherine Pemberton, now Lady Whitmore, finally gathered the courage to approach them. Julian saw her coming across the ballroom floor, her expression a complex mixture of curiosity, disdain, and something that might have been regret. She was as beautiful as ever in a gown of pale gold that must have cost a small fortune, dripping with jewels that announced her husband's wealth with vulgar clarity. When she reached them, she ignored Beatrice entirely and addressed Julian directly, her voice carrying that particular tone of false concern that aristocratic women wielded like a weapon. She told him how surprised she was to see him return to society, how she had heard the most extraordinary rumors about his transformation at Thornfield, and how she hoped he was not making decisions he would later regret based on gratitude or loneliness. The condescension in her words was breathtaking, the implication clear, that his attachment to Beatrice was a temporary madness born of desperation, and that he would eventually realize his mistake and return to pursuing women of appropriate standing. Julian felt Beatrice stiffen beside him, felt her begin to withdraw into protective silence, and in that moment, he made his choice. He responded to Catherine with perfect courtesy, but devastating honesty. He thanked her for her concern, but assured her that he had never been more clear-headed or certain of his path. He told her that losing his fortune had been the greatest gift of his life, because it had stripped away all the illusions that wealth and privilege created, had forced him to discover what truly mattered and who truly mattered. He explained that Beatrice had saved his life in ways Catherine could never understand, because she had never needed saving herself, had never faced real adversity or been forced to rely on her own character rather than her family name. And then, while the nearby guests fell silent to listen, while Catherine's face paled with the realization that she was being publicly criticized, Julian did something extraordinary. He turned to Beatrice, took both her hands in his, and told her in a voice loud enough to carry across a significant portion of the ballroom that he loved her, that he intended to marry her, and that he was asking her now, in front of witnesses who could never claim they misunderstood, to become his wife and the Duchess of Thornfield. The question hung in the air like lightning about to strike, and the entire ballroom seemed to hold its breath. Beatrice looked up at him with tears streaming down her face, her composure finally breaking under the weight of emotion and the magnitude of what he was doing. For a terrible moment, Julian feared she would refuse, would tell him that the cost was too high, that she could not accept the burden of being the woman who dragged a duke down from his proper place. But then she smiled, radiant and trembling and utterly beautiful, and she said yes. She said yes in a voice that shook, but carried conviction, said yes while looking not at the shocked faces surrounding them but directly into Julian's eyes, said yes to him and to their impossible future, and to the scandal that would inevitably follow. The moment her acceptance left her lips, Julian pulled her into his arms regardless of propriety, regardless of the hundreds of witnesses, and kissed her with all the pent-up passion and tenderness of the past year. It was a kiss that claimed and celebrated, that announced to everyone present that this was not a passing fancy or a moment of poor judgment, but a genuine love that would not be denied or hidden or apologized for. The reaction was immediate and explosive. Some guests gasped in shock at such a public display, others began talking loudly among themselves, and a few elderly matrons actually turned and walked out of the ballroom in protest. But others, more than Julian had dared hope, began to applaud. It started with Robert, who clapped slowly and deliberately, and was joined by the young Viscountess who had spoken to Beatrice earlier, and then by others scattered throughout the room, who chose in that moment to value authenticity over convention. The applause was not universal, not even close to a majority, but it was real and it was public, and it established that there would be at least some segment of society willing to accept their union. Catherine stood frozen, her expression a rictus of disbelief and wounded pride, clearly understanding that she had just witnessed her own replacement not by another aristocrat, but by a woman who had been invisible to her kind. Julian broke the kiss but kept Beatrice close, his arm around her waist in a possessive gesture that left no doubt about his intentions, and surveyed the ballroom with quiet satisfaction. He had done it. He had made his public declaration in a way that could never be taken back or minimized, had forced society to choose whether to accept or reject them, and though the battle was far from over, he had won the most important victory. He had claimed the woman he loved before the world, and neither of them had flinched. The wedding took place 3 months later in the small chapel at Thornfield Manor, a modest affair attended by the handful of people who truly mattered rather than the grand society spectacle Julian's first engagement would have produced. Robert Blackwood stood as his groomsman, and the young Viscountess who had championed Beatrice at the ball came all the way from London to serve as her attendant. The local tenants and villagers filled the pews, people who had come to respect both the Duke and his unusual bride through their shared work on the estate, and their genuine happiness for the couple meant more than any aristocratic approval could have. When Julian slipped the ring onto Beatrice's finger and spoke his vows, he was not just marrying a woman he loved, but was completing the transformation that had begun on that terrible night nearly 18 months earlier. He was choosing deliberately and publicly to build his life on a foundation of partnership and genuine affection rather than social expectation, and in doing so, he discovered a peace that had eluded him throughout his privileged youth. The scandal, of course, did not disappear overnight. London society spent months dissecting every aspect of their relationship, creating elaborate theories about how Beatrice had ensnared the Duke and speculating endlessly about how long the marriage would last before he came to his senses. The gossip columns were merciless. The invitations from certain quarters dried up entirely, and there were members of the aristocracy who would never forgive Julian for what they saw as his betrayal of their entire class. But there were also surprising sources of support. Other couples in unconventional marriages reached out to share their own stories. Younger members of the ton began to question whether the old rules served any useful purpose, and gradually a small but growing circle formed around Julian and Beatrice of people who valued substance over superficiality. More importantly, Thornfield itself continued to prosper under their joint management, becoming known throughout the region as a model of progressive agriculture and fair treatment of workers. Within 5 years, Julian had not only recovered his fortune, but exceeded his previous wealth, this time earned through genuine effort rather than inherited passively. The Duchess of Thornfield, as Beatrice became known, earned her own reputation as a woman of remarkable business acumen and quiet philanthropy, establishing schools for the children of tenant farmers and championing causes that her aristocratic peers found too common for their attention. Their first child, a daughter they named Eleanor after Beatrice's late mother, arrived 18 months after the wedding, and she was followed by 2 sons in quick succession. Julian discovered that fatherhood suited him far better than he had imagined, perhaps because he approached it without the rigid expectations and emotional distance that had characterized his own upbringing. He wanted his children to understand that their value came from who they were rather than what title they carried, that work was noble regardless of one's station, and that the measure of a person's worth was found in their character and choices rather than their bloodline. Beatrice proved to be as remarkable a mother as she was a partner, raising their children with both tenderness and high expectations, ensuring they learned to treat everyone they encountered with dignity, regardless of social position. The Thornfield nursery became known for its unusual atmosphere, where the Duke and Duchess were regularly seen playing with their children, rather than leaving them entirely to nurses and governesses. Another small rebellion against convention that gradually influenced others to reconsider their own practices. As the years passed and the initial scandal faded into accepted fact, Julian often reflected on the strange path his life had taken. He had lost everything he thought defined him, had been stripped bare of wealth and status, and forced to confront the hollow man he had been beneath all those external trappings. That loss, which had seemed like the end of his world, had actually been the beginning of his real life, the catalyst that forced him to develop genuine character and discover what truly mattered. He had gained far more than he lost. A partner who challenged and supported him in equal measure, a marriage built on mutual respect and authentic love, children who would grow up understanding that nobility was a matter of behavior rather than birth, and a peace with himself that no amount of aristocratic approval could have provided. The vindication he and Beatrice had achieved was not about proving their critics wrong or forcing society to accept them, though both had happened to some degree, but about proving to themselves that they had been right to choose love and partnership over convention and approval. They had built something real and lasting from the ashes of his former life, something that would outlive any scandal or gossip. And so, dear listener, as we close the chapter on Julian and Beatrice's story, I want you to take a moment to reflect on your own life and the choices before you. How many times have you held back from pursuing what you truly wanted because you feared judgment from others? How often have you measured your worth by external markers like job titles, income, or social status, rather than by the content of your character and the quality of your relationships? Julian's story teaches us that sometimes the greatest losses lead to the most valuable gains, that being stripped of everything we think defines us can reveal who we truly are beneath the surface. Beatrice's courage shows us that our value is inherent, not bestowed by others, and that we have every right to claim our place at the table regardless of where we started. Their love reminds us that genuine partnership, built on mutual respect and shared values, is worth more than any amount of superficial approval from people who judge based on appearances rather than substance. Whatever challenges you face, whatever obstacles stand between you and the life you truly want, remember that you have the power to choose authenticity over expectation, courage over comfort, and real connection over hollow prestige. Your worth is not determined by what others think of you, but by what you choose to do when tested, by how you treat others, and by whether you have the courage to build your life on a foundation of genuine values rather than borrowed opinions. Be bold enough to write your own story, brave enough to stand by your choices even when others criticize them, and wise enough to recognize that true nobility has nothing to do with titles and everything to do with character. The world needs more people willing to challenge unjust conventions, to see value where others see only limitations, and to build bridges across the artificial divisions that society constructs. Be one of those people, and may your own story of transformation and vindication be as remarkable as the one we have shared today.